Assalamu alaikum viewers, welcome to the 21st lecture of International Marketing subject. In this lecture, we will continue and conclude our discussion on the topic of international marketing research. In our previous lectures, we had identified 4 steps of international marketing research process. The first step is to define the problem, the issue for which research has to be conducted. Now, managers have to be very careful at this stage. More often, the mistakes are made at this stage that managers really could not understand the issue or the problem correctly. Hence, the research which followed was done on an improperly understood issue, so the research findings basically were wrong. So, managers are more often, because they could not properly define or understand the issue, they end up doing a right research on a wrong issue. Now, this problem really amplifies when managers are doing research in international markets, because those markets to a large extent are new markets, new societies for the managers, and many things are unknown, and hence more chances that managers may misperceive the problem, may misunderstand the problem for which they would conduct research. So at this level, the managers have to be very careful. They may conduct exploratory research in order to understand the issue, the problem better before they proceed on to the next step. So once it is established carefully that the issue, the problem in question is properly understood, then managers can proceed to the second step of international marketing research, that is to develop the research plan. Now, research plan really depends on the nature of the issue, how the issue or the problem has been defined. Again, in our previous lecture, we had a detailed discussion on this aspect, that the problem or issue can be described in 2 ways. One, either it pertains to an objective reality, that what research is going to investigate, the issue, the reality is objective, is existing outside humans, that humans with their various thoughts or opinions cannot change the reality, like is the case in case of many physical realities we see around us. The force of gravity, the speed of light, the rotation of planets. Now, all these phenomena are happening as an objective reality, and these phenomena or realities of these phenomena are not going to change with different perception of different people. So these type of realities we describe as objective realities. Now, in case of physical forces, physical phenomena or chemical phenomena or other scientific phenomena, it's very easy to understand why we describe these as objective realities. But situations become more confusing when managers are investigating social phenomena, because social phenomena or societies are very much dependent on human construction, human understanding, human subjectivity. Given the same situation, 2 persons or more than 2 persons are going to perceive the same situation very differently, because of their agency, because of their subjectivity, their opinion, their own context, their own backgrounds. So the second way to describe a problem or an issue or a reality for which research is to be conducted is a subjective reality, that the truth or the nature of phenomena depends on the construction of human mind. So different people will view it differently, will perceive it differently. Hence, reality and its nature and its description is not independent of humans, rather it depends on humans' opinions, it is within their own minds. So depending on how a manager has described the nature of the reality, the rest of the research plan will depend on that choice or that description. If the reality or the phenomena for which research is to be conducted has been described as an objective reality, then it is going to be a scientific research, and scientific methods will be deployed for this type of research, and data would exist and would be collected in quantitative form. And various statistical techniques then can be applied on quantified data for analysis. On the contrary, if the reality has been described to be subjective reality, then different methodologies to be applied. Qualitative research techniques have to be applied here in order to understand how human mind constructs these realities. Now, depending on how the issue has been described, then the manager has to choose the methodology or plan the research accordingly. So it's very crucial for the choice of methodology that manager first describe the nature of the truth, the nature of the phenomena, the nature of the reality for which a research has to be conducted. So research plan may be quantitative research, and hence quantitative research methodologies and techniques and procedures will be applied, or qualitative research where qualitative methods, procedures and techniques will be applied, or it can be a mixed research where both quantitative data and quantitative techniques of analysis and qualitative data and qualitative technique of analysis will be used to corroborate, to triangulate, and hence to arrive at the analysis. So it has to be very clear beforehand that what type of methodology is to be applied depending on how the problem has been defined. So much of the research to follow is already established in terms of methods and methodology in the first step, when the nature of phenomena or nature of reality which is under investigation is described and defined. So research plan then basically identifies the information requirements, what type of information is needed to seek the explanation, to seek the answers, to seek the truth about the phenomena under investigation in the research. And accordingly, the needs for secondary data and how it's going to be collected will become part of the plan, and then if needed, then primary research data collection, for which a control mechanism has to be decided and established at the planning stage, because primary research is a delicate affair. It can go wrong in many ways, and more often when the research plan itself is very sound, the research can go wrong at the time of its implementation and collection of data. There can be various reasons for it to go wrong, which we had discussed in our previous lecture. So it's very important that as managers are planning primary data collection, at the same time they must also plan the control mechanism for checks and balances that ensures that the primary research will be implemented correctly. And then of course, for primary research out of the population, managers have to identify and decide the sampling plan. What should be the sampling frame? That out of the population, what are the type of people that will become target for sample selection? Then what will be the sample selection methodology? Would it be random sampling, or it will be non-random sampling? So method of extracting targets, respondents from the sample, from the population, have to be decided as part of the research plan. So once research plan is finalized, then is the time to implement this research. So implementation stage again has to be very carefully undertaken, because it becomes even more complex in international marketing environments, and because of a number of markets. So managers have to very carefully and professionally implement the research plan so that nothing goes wrong there, and the research and its data collection process is fair, is unbiased, and is according to the plan which had been decided in step number 2. We had discussed up till this stage in our previous lectures, and now in today's lecture we'll move to discuss the third and the final stage of the international marketing research process, that is analyzing the data that has been collected. Now this is the crux of the research, analysis and interpretation of data, which requires a lot of creativeness and professionalism and techniques to come together, to understand the data and to try to answer the research problem, the research issue which has been defined and described in step number 1. One important thing that needs to be understood, that research and its findings quite often are used by somebody who has not been part and parcel of the research. A manager and a researcher may have conducted a research, but findings of the research may be of use or may be used by many other people, many other managers. Or maybe there is a firm which is there to conduct research only. So it is a research firm and it does research for its clients, which are marketing firms or other firms. So quite often the research is read by and is used by somebody else who has not been part and parcel of planning and implementing and analyzing research and writing the research report. Now this brings in special caution, that the reader not only would want to read the results and the analysis, but reader would also want to be sure, be convinced that the research was done appropriately, or the research can be applied to the reader's situation. It is a similar situation as we had discussed in case of secondary data, that a lot of caution has to be exercised if a researcher uses secondary data sources. The researcher has to see the background of the data as to who collected the data, for what purpose the data was collected, what method and methodologies were used for planning to collect that data, what controls were implemented to ensure the data that was collected was correct, was unbiased, was proper, was comprehensive, and what methods and techniques were used to analyze the data, and then what were the findings of those data, or what does those data represent. So only the findings will not be good enough. How those findings were arrived at, their integrity, their thoroughness, their purpose, and the background of the researcher is all very important for the user, because the user will not be able to trust the data, will not be able to understand the application of data so long as how data was collected, who collected the data, how data was analyzed, how it was controlled and checked that proper data was collected. Everything is really done. So it is essential that at the time of writing research report, all these things are detailed and included for the benefit of the third party or the reader. Because the reader or the user of this research, if he or she is not part and parcel of this research process itself, will want to be convinced about all these background elements. So it's very important that for primary research, in the report itself, at the time of analyzing and writing the report, the data sources must be identified. If secondary data was used, now those secondary data sources must be clearly identified. And if primary data was collected, again, who were the respondents, what was their background, how sampling was done, how those respondents were approached. So all these things must be detailed for the benefit of the user of the research finding. The data projection must also be explained. Collecting raw data is one thing, but then analyzing data is also very important. From what perspective data was analyzed, and from what perspective it was not analyzed. What data was collected, and what data perhaps was not collected. So data in front of the user is one thing, but then there is a lot of information which has not been part and parcel of the research, and it's not in front of the user. And user would want to know what is collected and what is not collected, because that decision was made by the researcher. In fact, this is where a big argument also comes in, that the researchers and scholars who belong to the qualitative stream of research argue that there is no reality that exists outside humans. Because in quantitative research method, not only realities exist outside humans, the researcher and his background also has no role in as far as research and its analysis is concerned. It is assumed that so long as method and methodology in quantitative research is correct and is properly documented and described, the user of research will have no problem, no issue in understanding and using the data and its analysis. But the scholars from qualitative research streams argue that it's just not possible. Involvement of researcher and people is always there. And the strongest argument they present is that they were humans who decided to collect data on some aspects, but also decided not to collect data on other aspects. There is no situation that we know on which all possible data was ever collected. Because one, it is humanly not possible. Or maybe it is just impossible because of technology and techniques. So every type of research, according to this argument, is basically influenced by human decisions, by human subjectivity, by human choices. And hence the description of reality itself. So what choice humans made in terms of what type of data to be collected regarding a phenomenon, an issue or a problem or whatever is the case may be. They must also describe how they arrived to this decision, that which variables to be included in research and which variables not to be included in research. Because this decision was made by researchers and they should document it and they should explain it for the benefit of the user. For primary research, as we have been elaborating, in the research itself, it must be identified who were the target respondents that provided response for the research in terms of primary data. Because background of those respondents again is very important. In our earlier lectures, we have mentioned various times that it's important that what is being said, but it's also important in this context that who is saying it, when that person is saying it, under what context that person is saying it. Because as I said, one of the first lessons marketers learn is words do not have meaning, people have meaning. Context is very important. So data is response given to a questionnaire perhaps by respondents. But then who was giving this response, under what condition, will have bearing on the response itself. Well, this is common sense. So how do we trust a research when this issue or this matter is not documented, is not properly explained for the benefit of the user? If a research data is provided to me and based on a questionnaire, a response from respondents, it's not good enough. I want to really have a confidence in that research. So I want to know as much as possible that who are those respondents, under what situation a response was given. Well, I can give a very crude example. For example, if there is a transaction which has taken place for selling property perhaps. So if it is documented that a person A sold property to person B. Now the researcher would want to know under what conditions the property was sold, whether the person A who was selling this property was doing it voluntarily or under duress. That somebody at a gunpoint or was putting pressure on person A to sell the property. It was an involuntary transaction. Similarly, responses can be involuntary responses, or responses can be subject to some other stress or duress, or the person giving response perhaps for one or another reason was not competent to give that response or could not have understood the question. So research user want to take confidence in that finding, especially when the application or research is an important area where stakes are very high. So it is important for the persons who are writing an analysis report or research report that they have also to identify the respondents, their backgrounds, and the context in which response was received from those respondents, so that the user of research can then take confidence that the response that was given is valid and was not under some sort of duress or stress, or the respondent was competent to give that sort of response. Many a times the respondents may be incapable of giving a certain type of response. We can take example of a household survey from housewives perhaps. In some countries the literacy rates on average is quite high, and the education level is higher and education is provided to most of the people. So even housewives can easily discuss complex affairs of life, issues and issues pertaining to modernity of life. So if there is a survey which is seeking information on modern aspects of life, then housewives in countries where literacy rate is high, where education background is strong, education is widespread, so it can be expected that housewives can freely and confidently and properly discuss and give response on such questions or such issues. Whereas housewives in countries where literacy rates are low, education is not that common, and large part of population is not exposed to modernities of life, then if a similar household survey is conducted in such markets and response is sought from housewives, then it's quite unlikely that they will be able to give a proper response, because the issue or the research problem was perhaps beyond their comprehension or beyond their experience. So identifying background of respondents and their context and situation helps to reconcile these type of questions and conflicts which may arise in the mind of the user of research. So it is critical and it is necessary that the researcher not only documents the findings of the research and its analysis, but also whole procedure, who was the respondent, what were their background, their context, and under what situation the data was, their response was received from the target respondents. So this should be integral part of the research report. Finally, in the research report, it is important to identify the alternative courses of action. Seldom there will be a situation when there is one explanation or one suggested solution of a problem. More often there will be a situation that alternative possibilities would be there. So it is useful, rather it is essential for those who are writing research reports, the analysis of research findings, they must also identify the alternative course of actions or alternative explanations, because they are arriving at one conclusion. So in the process, they perhaps have rejected other alternatives, or perhaps they have identified one alternative to be more suitable, more better explanation or solution of problem than others for certain rationale. So merely just identifying one interpretation or one solution or one finding may not suffice. Any rational user would always think, was there any other possibility or any other way to interpret these findings? So again, if there is a situation, which quite often is, that there can be various explanations of data or various conclusions of data, then the alternative explanation, alternative conclusion should also be discussed, should also be identified for the benefit of the user. So these are some of the essential attributes of a proper analysis of research and a proper research report. The researchers must understand that quite often their research findings will be used by somebody else who has not been part and parcel of this research. They must include those aspects which they considered, which they faced, which they observed in the course of their own research and its analysis. And as much as possible, they should document these things for the benefit of the user, because when user is going to use this research and its finding, these questions will come into the mind of the user. And if these questions are not answered, then the user may have less confidence in this research and its findings. So for the research to be complete and to be suitable completely for the use, research, its background, its process, the alternative conclusions and possibilities and situations, the background of the respondents, the context of the respondents, all these must be part and parcel of the research report. A major issue which arises when such researches are conducted across national boundaries is the issue of translation. That if simultaneously a research is taking place in many countries where different languages are spoken, then the research questionnaire or research questions will be translated into a suitable language of that country. Even if research is to be conducted in our country, some people can fluently speak English and converse in English language, while there are many who cannot. So often we see that the questionnaires or questions are translated into English as well as into Urdu and maybe other languages for the benefit of the respondent, so the respondent can easily understand. Now this translation aspect brings in errors. That while translating from one language to another language, to preserve all the context, all the concept in all its understanding is often impossible. So a lot of care has to be taken in this translation process. One of the care is to be equivalence of language. The researchers must ensure language and its interpretation, its theme that emerges in the original survey questionnaire or questions in terms of language must be preserved while translating into another language for the benefit of respondent in another country. The method of translation must be identified again, that how the translation was conducted, because different people from different cultures, from different societies have different ways of looking towards the world. They use their own lens of values and experiences to look towards the world. To arrive at a same conclusion, a different explanation may be needed. People who live in our country look at the world and its affair with our own lens. People who live in the West look towards many aspects, especially social aspects, religious aspects, consumption aspects, with their own lens and values. And we have discussed in our lecture on culture that humans' beliefs and value systems and the culture in which they have been brought up really defines the way people look towards the world. So while this translation is being done, especially when research and surveys pertain to social aspects, the equivalence of translation must also ensure that people in another country, in another society, should perceive the questions in the questionnaire in the same way as expected or as established by the researcher in the research plan. Another issue which often arises when conducting research across nations, across countries, is that of instrumentation and measurement. In some countries, still, the distances are measured in kilometers, while in others, in miles. In some cases, a distance which is considered very far from home may be few kilometers, if people are not used to traveling so much, while in another case, a distance that is far from home may be tens of miles. In our cities, in our country, traveling is a difficult venture because of public transport is not so well established. The roads are often crowded at rush hours, and only few people have efficient modes of transportation like cars, etc. So traveling distances of few kilometers for work every day seems like a very long distance traveled. But in developed countries, in industrialized countries, where they have wide network of roads and scattered cities, and quality of life is also not limited to large cities, it is dispersed in rural areas also. So often people live in suburban areas, in rural areas, and travel to cities, maybe 30 kilometers, 40 kilometers a day for work. So in their perception, that may be a manageable distance, maybe not too far. But in our country, if somebody has to travel every day 30-40 kilometers for work, then it may be too much because of our difference in perceptions, different in situation, different in circumstances. So not only the instruments that are used for measurement must have equivalence when surveys are being conducted across nation, at the same time perception of distances or perception of measurements must also be similar when response is being sought. So critical issue that additionally emerges in international marketing research is of numerous markets. Very often the research is done in a number of markets. So there can be an error caused by the way the problem is defined. Now the problem and its definition is very much subjective and conceptual. And the questions that are asked in questionnaires also based on certain expectations, certain backgrounds, for these questions to be understood properly. So while surveys are being conducted into many markets, this can vary. This can vary rather very easily. So a lot of care has to be taken that the problems of research are understood in the same way across the countries which have been included for research. Instrument error, which we have already discussed, must be looked into. That why research is being conducted into many markets at the same time simultaneously, and for finding and analysis all these data has to be combined and compared. Then there should be no instrument error. All instruments that have been used, if it is a survey instrument, then the questions should be appropriate for each market in the same way. If measurement instruments have been selected, they should also be perceived similar in each market. As I had described in my previous lecture, that often we use Likert scale rate 1:5 for measuring a response, extent of feeling about something. In some countries 1:5 is acceptable. People can respond that okay, 2 or 3 means high, quite high. But in many other countries, people may perceive that 5 or 6 is high, 2 or 3 is a small number, which is really a background and perception. So how the survey questionnaire, how the interview questions have been devised, all these instruments not only must have equivalence in terms of language and its interpretation, they must also have equivalence in terms of these measurement scales or any other measurement aspect. Another issue which arises due to numerous markets is the frame error. For survey purposes, certainly whole populations are target, especially for consumer surveys. But then it's not possible to access whole populations. Then researchers, for their convenience and to manage the research, decide that they'll choose their sample from certain respondents out of the population who can be accessible. So they describe a frame. And these frames may change. These frames may change from place to place. Well, I can give an example. It is a real example. There was a firm in Singapore that I was associated with. They sold watches and jewelry to exclusive people. Now, in order to ascertain market of jewelry and expensive watches which are exclusive, very high class, then in Far Eastern markets, the target people may be rich affluent businessmen and royalties, or people high in government places. So all these potential people are the target people. To seek response as to identify the potential of market, if a survey has to be done, then in some countries it is possible to access such people. But then there are other countries where there are royalties, royal families, and to access them due to protocol issues and other barriers is just not possible. So it is easy to access respondent from a frame in one country. It may be difficult to access respondent from a similar frame from another country. This problem must be addressed in case of numerous markets, that eventually the researchers may end up choosing different types of frames for selecting their samples. So they must compare and must ensure and discuss that even if the frames are in some way different, for selecting of samples for response, there is an equivalence, there will be no error. Another error which may emerge is how respondents were selected from these frames. Very often, random sampling cannot be applied in such researches. Well, ideally, it should be random sample from a chosen frame, so that every target respondent has equal chance of being selected for response, for the response to be unbiased. But that's just not possible. If respondents out of population of a country are randomly selected, then it is impossible for researcher to ensure that every respondent has been approached to seek the response. For example, there may be a telephone directory that may be available, and out of those a random sampling was done and respondents were identified, a sample of respondents, and the surveyor started to call them. Would it be possible that surveyor will be able to get through and get response from all the chosen people in the random sample? No. It is more difficult in case of household surveys or intercept surveys or physical surveys of people. So quite often researchers do what is called convenience sampling, that they adopt a method that can help them conveniently to approach the respondents and get a response from them. So in many ways, the way the final respondents were chosen from the frame may differ from one market to another market to another market. This can be a big source of error in research and its findings. because the respondents may not have similar representation from different markets. Now this has to be carefully addressed and carefully documented, how sample was chosen and how can researcher really establish the way sample were chosen in one market vis-a-vis another market for research. It can be compared and data can be reconciled. There will be no error because the samples were chosen or the respondents were chosen in a different way. Another issue which we identified very importantly was non-response error. Well, the data that we often see is what the response was achieved. What we do not see in research reports often that who did not respond. People have different cultural backgrounds. They have their own social issues, social backgrounds. In some societies, people more freely discuss things. In other societies, people are reluctant for whatever reason. And a lot of response that did not come may be due to contextual issues, different social backgrounds. So while a research is being conducted simultaneously in many markets, in many countries, this non-response can vary from different markets due to various reasons. So it is again imperative, essential for a researcher and for the person who is writing the research report, while he or she is identifying, analyzing and discussing the data that has been collected, must also discuss why some of the respondents to whom questionnaire was sent or who were approached failed to respond or did not respond. Because that will clarify some of the aspects of non-response. And reasons for non-response surely do vary from market to market. And research cannot be complete without really discussing the issue of non-response. Again, to recap, while using secondary data from various markets simultaneously for one research, the researcher has to be very careful, because different governments, different organizations, different people collect data for their own use, for their own purpose in these different markets. Even if it's data on common variable like per capita income or literacy rate or household lifestyles or whatever. Since it was collected by different agencies, different organizations with different purposes, so there are a lot of reasons that these data may not be comparable or may not be properly combined in one piece of research. So it's very, very important that the researcher is very, very careful, even if is using secondary data from different markets on the same variable. Must clearly assess and discuss the backgrounds pertaining to those secondary data from different markets. While comparing data on the same variable, must also ensure that data was collected properly and the method through which data was collected is also comparable. In primary research, issue of language must be reconciled. I think it requires a lot of emphasis, because translation can cause a lot of differences and a lot of errors, especially when research is being conducted into many markets. So we have discussed that through back translation or through parallel translation, this error can be improved. And such procedures must be adopted to ensure and for the benefit of the user of research that the translation had no error in the research. In case of social research, the differences between countries in aspects of their life and lifestyle and sociology can be immense, can be major, can be substantial. So very important that social organizations, social setups in various countries, various markets is properly reconciled and discussed while conducting research or seeking response on social aspects, because people from different culture, different backgrounds see towards various things in different way. Method of obtaining response again may work well in some markets, may not work well in other markets. In some markets it may be easy and manageable and relevant to collect data on telephone, while in other markets people are not used to giving personal information response on telephone. In some countries it can be okay to intercept people for research questionnaire, but in other countries people may not be used to such collection method. So the researcher may end up using different methods of data collection in different markets. Again, it is important that these must be reconciled so that there is no error because of different methods, or same method may have different implications in different markets. For collecting data, again, there can be infrastructure constraints. Well, it's easy to travel distances in some countries because of efficient transport systems and infrastructure, while it may be difficult in other countries, especially when the research needs to collect data for far-flung areas, from remote areas. In some countries, it may be very, very difficult. So, that issue again has to be reconciled in research and in research report. In many cases, we see that across markets, the consumer behavior may be converging on some things, or maybe not converging in some other things. So, the researcher has to be very careful. While conducting research pertaining to consumer behavior, the researcher has to see in which markets the behavior may be converging, on what aspects, and on what aspects it may not be converging. We can take example of our own market. The consumer behavior is ever evolving, and it can change often unpredictably. Well, that's my assumption, and I'm observing it, which I want to share with you. That as I see my own society in Pakistan, I could see when I was young, people were getting exposed to Western cultures. And increasingly I could see, at least in men, that they were wearing Western attire. When I was young, fresh graduate, at that time in late 70s, early 80s, if I have to dress up properly for some function, for meeting, I will have a Western style dress. A trouser and a jacket and a tie, perhaps, like I am dressed today. But our consumption of technology was very different, was not converging with the West, while our way of dressing was converging with the West. As I see the situation now, interesting things I am observing. Again, I am cautioning that research has to be done to establish this fact. This is just my observation and feeling. That I see the society is getting much more confident. So we are not converging towards the West in consumption of food or dresses. Rather, I can now increasingly see that people are using and wearing our own local traditional dresses, even for very important occasions. And now I can see the resurgence and an increased popularity of local cuisine. People are not much excited now about Western foods as they used to be some years ago. It's because of the confidence. So, while it converged earlier, as I could see, now it is moving on its own way, separate way, away from Western practices and culture. But on aspects of technology, I can see starking similarity. The diffusion of telecommunication, mobiles in our society, diffusion of IT and computer in our homes, in our household, in our lives, is happening almost in a similar way as in any advanced industrialized country. The mobile phone connectivity has phenomenally increased in our country in recent years, which spells this convergence. So, society is converging on some aspects of consumption, while it is diverging, it's not converging, moving separate ways in many other ways. So, consumer behaviors keep on moving, keep on evolving. So, for purpose of research, the researcher has to be very cautious about this aspect, whether consumer behavior in various markets is similar or it is moving in opposite direction. Now, before we conclude our discussion on international marketing research, there are a few quick tips I want to give to you. All discussion that we have done is making us very cautious. Don't do this, don't do this, be careful. It is so difficult to conduct research, especially primary research. Even using data, which secondary data, it can be prone to many errors. So at the end, it is very difficult, it's very complex to conduct a major primary research and do it correctly. So international marketers are often using some tested and tried method for estimation of their markets or analyzing situations in their markets. One is demand pattern analysis. That in various countries, there are always macro level data that is available. So in countries there are reports, there are researches being done by the governments and by other agencies which are listing and documenting and providing data on continuous basis on consumption patterns, industrialization patterns. So these data tell the level of consumption of certain products, the direction of industrialization, the growth in income and spending of people, and from there the researchers can find information about demand patterns and trends from various markets. Multi-factor indexes are being constructed on these macroeconomic variables in various countries. When countries are not affluent, then incomes are mostly spent on textile products and basic essentials. But when the economies become prosperous, then industrialization starts to take place and consumption patterns also change. The industry products are more in demand and people are also demanding more durable goods, more luxury goods. So the demand patterns through these indexes can provide a lot of clues as to the potentials in those markets. Income elasticity measurements can also help. Certain goods are less elastic, while other goods are more income elastic. And these measures can be calculated for various markets. Especially when incomes are low, then consumption of essential goods is income inelastic. That even if their price changes a little bit up or down, their consumption will not vary because those are essential goods. But durable goods and luxury goods are more income elastic. As income rises beyond certain level, their consumption really increases quite a lot. So seeing the level of development, the level of economy of a country and growth in economy can provide clues as to the demand in those countries. Another technique through which estimations can be done is through analogy. That in certain countries, macroeconomic variables can be used to derive relationship between certain economic variables and certain consumption patterns. Now, using these relationships, demands can be derived if some of these variables are known in other markets. For example, if per capita income is related to number of televisions being purchased in a market, then knowing per capita income in another market, one can derive the demand for television. Time series approach can also help, that in certain countries, at certain economic level, there was a certain consumption of certain type of products. Now this relationship can be used in another country, which is at a level of economic development, at a level of economy, per capita income, and from that it can be calculated or it can be assumed that what should be potential demand for a certain product. Comparative analysis can be done. Countries that are similar or certain economic aspects, the potential of markets can be assessed. And that potential market can be in consumption, in terms of diffusion of technologies, and that can also be in terms of usage and other aspects. So by comparing and clustering markets, the researchers can find what should be the potential of various types of products in those markets. Now these various techniques will also be displayed on the screen, so researchers can use them as a substitute for conducting primary research. Thank you for being with us today. Allah Hafiz.